in a modern scientific perspective, materialism, the notion that brain creates consciousness, has been discarded because it does not fit the bigger pattern of data. And yes, we are very interested in trying to assemble that larger worldview of idealism or panentheism that allows for this kind of primacy of consciousness, the same thing that quantum physicists have been claiming is real for more than a century. And now finally, with all of this other evidence, near-death experiences, shared death, which are just like near-death but happen in perfectly healthy people, after-death communications, telepathy, remote viewing, all the evidence we have for non-local consciousness. And then you have a tremendous body of evidence, something I never realized before my coma, but after my coma, I knew that reincarnation was absolutely an essential part of understanding human existence.
Welcome. I'm here today with Dr. Eben Alexander. Dr. Alexander, welcome.
Well, Sean, it's great to be with you today. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on as well. So just for folks who've been living under a rock, can you just provide a brief background of yourself and then just quickly relate the experience that kind of got you into this kind of near-death space?
Okay, well, I had my near-death experience back in 2008 in November. At that time, I was a 54-year-old conventional neurosurgeon, neuroscientist. I bought into the conventional training of the 20th and early 21st century, that is materialism or physicalism, the notion that only the physical world exists, so therefore you must somehow explain all of consciousness, beliefs, awareness, attitudes, thoughts, as being epiphenomena of the physical workings of the brain. And that's where I think my near-death experience came in so handy, because it was such a perfect model for human death. I had E. coli meningoencephalitis. E. coli is one of the worst kind of bacteria you can have to infect your brain. In fact, at the beginning of my week in coma, my doctors estimated I had a 10% chance of survival. By the end of the week, only 2% chance, without any reasonable chance of recovery. And that's why at the end of that week, they suggested taking me off the ventilator, off the 3 powerful antibiotics, and just letting nature take its course. And it was soon thereafter that I started coming back to the world. But when I did, my brain was still absolutely savaged by this should have killed me infection. And in fact, an amnesia that I had had all through my NDE, which is very atypical. You don't usually find that extreme amount of amnesia for one's personal life or humanity and Earth, this universe, but that's what I had. And of course, the mystery to me began to unfold in the months after my coma, because given that amnesia, I didn't even remember enough of the neuroscience to understand why my experience completely violated all the tenets of modern neuroscience. I shouldn't have had any kind of dream or hallucination, much less the most extraordinary experience of my entire existence. And that is something that's explored, especially in a medical case report on my medical records. It was written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. That came out September 2018 in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases by Dr. Serby Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson. And they made it very clear that my brain could not have had, it was too damaged, and there was no part of it left unscathed to support any kind of dream or hallucination. And that, I think, is where my case adds so much to the scientific literature on this subject, because of that extreme damage, which you often don't expect in the cardiac arrests and things that give you a temporary cessation of blood flow to the brain. But in my case, you had a week-long period of extreme damage. And that's the part that really awakened me. And also a point I would make about that medical case report is when the 3 doctors were challenged, how do you explain this unprecedented recovery from this illness? They said it's because he had a near-death experience. And they knew of other cases of profound near-death experiences that were associated with this miraculous form of healing, like Anita Morjani, whose advanced lymphoma disappeared after she had an NDE, or Dr. Mary C. Neal, who had an over 30-minute warm water drowning while she was kayaking in Chile in the late 1990s. And you ask any doctor what your brain would be like after more than 30 minutes of warm water drowning, they'd say, no, it's turning to mush. And yet she was brought to the surface dead and then had a full recovery.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
And so I've spent the 16 years since my coma trying to explain that extraordinary multi-layered journey that I had when my brain was inactivated by this extreme case of bacterial meningitis. The spiritual experience itself, of course, I've explained in great detail in the book Proof of Heaven, and I've also told of thousands of times on the internet. There are many versions out there, but it basically was a 3-level journey that involved passages multiple times through these 3 levels. Starting the Earth Were My View, a primitive, course, unresponsive kind of subterranean existence, but through a light portal associated with music, it led up into this brilliant, ultra-real Gateway Valley, where my spiritual companion, a beautiful young woman on a butterfly wing, turned out to be very important to me in life, but I didn't find that out for 4 months after my coma. And that is all related to a deep story about my adoption history. And then, of course, there was a level beyond that beautiful Gateway Valley where I was so reassured with a lesson I'm sure I was to bring back here. That is, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. That's the message that was delivered to me telepathically by this beautiful woman on the butterfly wing. And then, the whole story, it's much more intense beyond that. But I went to a higher level also. Important to point out that the musical kind of experience of the chants and anthems and hymns that were being provided in that Gateway Valley provided yet another musical portal to higher and higher levels, what I call the core, which is a complete resolution of all dualities into pure oneness, a recognition that my conscious awareness was directly sourced in that God force that is so reassuring to near-death experiencers over thousands of years across all belief systems, across all continents. And really, that's the thing to be shared, is that beautiful sense of spiritual home and our togetherness. Now, multiple passages through all that. It's a very long overall story. I won't go into all that now because it's available elsewhere. And I think you have some places that we'd rather go in our discussion that cover a more kind of global assessment of this kind of journey and the conclusions that the modern scientific community is making about all this.
Now, 2 quick questions on your experience. Why do you think you had that amnesia? Was it because of the damaged neocortex, or was it something else that was atypical?
I know it was partially that, although certainly I know of other cases of extreme trauma, in forms of infections, what have you, brain tumors, brain swelling, where someone has perfect knowledge of their journey. Important to point out that an NDE is always tailored directly for the individual who has it, period. That's a very important concept. Now, when we study them in large numbers, we find patterns that show us that they're revealing a realm that actually exists. But the important thing is that they're mainly there for the person having them. And it turns out I know in my own mind, and this is based on meditations and things that I explain in our 3rd book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that go way beyond the Proof of Heaven contained in the book Proof of Heaven. But I know enough to know that if I had had a more standard NDE where I had remembered everything, and in that event, if I had scripted it, my own adoptive father would have been there. He was a globally renowned neurosurgeon, the man who raised me, the man who was such a mentor, such a wonderful person for me to try and emulate. He was an incredibly good physician, and he had passed over 4 years before my coma. So if I had scripted it, he would have been there front and center. But I also know enough about all of this and about my journey and about these journeys in general to know if I had had that more standard conventional NDE, where I remembered everything and then saw my own adoptive father there as the guardian angel who ushered me around, I would have been more tempted to dismiss it all. I would have thought, oh, well, you just see who you want to see on the way out. How can I know that was real? Even though it seemed way too real to be real, which was the way I described it. But that's why I needed a whole extra level. And also, being a neuroscientist, neurosurgeon, fascinated by memory and consciousness, I needed to go a huge distance further in this journey for me to come back and actually conclude that it was all very real in a real realm and that I needed to pay attention.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
And so, in other words, I needed a whole different step to reveal to me the power and the ultra reality of that realm. And that had to do with the identity of that guardian angel. And it turns out that it was a benefit to me that it was not my adoptive father, even though he appeared to me in meditation 2.5 years after my coma. All that is described in the book Living in a Mindful Universe, because we make an excellent case there for how memories are not even stored in the brain. You know, that's something neurosurgeons have suspected for the better part of a century, because we've never done a brain resection that was reported to uncover the loss of a long-term swathe of long-term memories. That's never happened. And if you've never removed any brain that was associated with extinction of long-term memories, then we start to conclude that memories are not even stored in the brain. And we talk about that in great detail in that book because it's an important point. It's really, in many ways, the last nail in the coffin of materialist neuroscience that's trying to explain all this in a purely physicalist or materialist way. And yet we know that does not work. In a modern scientific perspective, materialism, you know, the notion that brain creates consciousness, has been discarded because it does not fit the bigger pattern of data. And yes, we are very interested in trying to assemble that larger worldview of idealism or panentheism that allows for this kind of primacy of consciousness, the same thing that quantum physicists have been claiming is real for more than a century. And now finally, with all of this other evidence, you know, near-death experiences, shared death, which are just like near-death but happen in perfectly healthy people, after-death communications, telepathy, remote viewing, all the evidence we have for non-local consciousness. And then you have a tremendous body of evidence, something I never realized before my coma, but after my coma, I knew that reincarnation was absolutely an essential part of understanding human existence, although we have program forgetting. So most of us don't remember past life and between life memories beyond age 6 or 7. But I didn't realize before my coma, there's a huge scientific literature on reincarnation. Just as one example, the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, they've studied more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation over the last 60 or so years. And of those 2,500 cases they've studied, they've actually found 1,700 that they say are solved. That is where they actually found the person who lived before, based on claims by the young child about names, events, modes of death. And important to point out, this is not just some vague kind of acquisition of information that's irrelevant by a child, you know, who's recently born, but they have phobias, they have nightmares. In fact, 1/3 of Ian Stevenson's original cases of past life memories in children, 1/3 of them had birthmarks or physical deformities that corresponded with the lethal wound of the prior incarnation. When you study this literature, you get quite amazed. And it was compiled by a group of rigorous, skeptical scientists, and they ended up showing something that many cultures have just known to be real for ages, just because of stories told within the culture. But again, important to point out, none of us is really expected to retain these memories beyond age 6 or 7 because they tend to be covered over by natural process. And I think that is to kind of give us skin in the game. And for whatever reason, humanity at this point in our development, and I will point out also, you know, we generally think knowledge increases as, as time goes on for humanity. But it's pretty clear that we've had great knowledge in the past that then was lost to humanity. And I think our spiritual knowledge has been far greater in the past. And now we see this resurgence of evidence of the reality of the spiritual realm, like these past life memories in children, rigorously studied by scientists and revealing, yes, our souls do come back again and again in this process of refinement and growth. And in essence, we're recovering knowledge that I think was more common in the past in certain segments of humanity. And in many ways, as much as, I studied materialism and I realize how materialist science in the 20th and early 21st century has been associated with progress. I mean, look at communications, look at transportation, look at medicine, and a lot of what we've done there, even though some of that is also questionable. But the bottom line is we've had tremendous progress. But in addition, look at the threats of modern warfare and how the chemists committed their sin in World War I with poisonous gases, explosives, and machine guns. Physicists committed their sin in World War II with the advent of nuclear weapons. And I'm sure if we ever have a World War III, that World War IV, as Einstein said, will be fought with sticks and stones. So we should not make the mistake of thinking there's a winnable nuclear war. And it's hard not to acknowledge also the price we've paid for example, our addiction to fossil fuels and energy, burning coal and burning oil and wood. Any carbon-based fuel is putting CO2 in the atmosphere. And no matter how much some people might want to deny it, the fact of the matter, a simple chemical fact, is you keep building up CO2 and you're going to heat the planet. I can show you an article from 1912 where a scientist was making a very good point that if we kept burning wood and coal, as he put it, the planet would warm because of carbon dioxide, and sooner or later it would become uninhabitable. This is something known in the early 20th century. And yet you find scientists kind of denying it, ignoring it, even in the current era, even though those scientists who pay attention to climate realize we've already started to tumble over the abyss. We need to become far better stewards of our planet. And that's part of this whole awakening that we're talking about.
Well, the other thing that kind of plays into that, too, is the universe seems to have kind of a natural offsetting mechanism in the sense that the population actually is just starting to decline. For instance, in China, it started declining in February, I think, of 2022. And that has a whole other set of challenges. But there's appears to be some hidden hand or self-correcting mechanism that not necessarily is offset, but seems to enable us to push forward in our evolution. So another question about kind of just the fundamental nature of reality. You mentioned that the brain does not, or there hasn't been proof that the brain stores memory, that it's somehow outside. That would imply that the brain, at least the physical brain, has some mechanism to act as an antenna of some sort. Is this the caudate putamen?
Well, actually, it's much more complicated than that. People want to stick it to one little structure and say, this does this. And I think every time we try and isolate something as broad as consciousness, given that consciousness is the only thing that anyone has ever known to exist, is the inside of their own consciousness. So we really have to kind of expand our models far beyond materialism and trying to pretend that the caudate putamen, for example, is the transceiver element of the brain. I think it's very misleading. I think a lot of the brain is involved in this, and it's essentially looking at the brain as you point out. Transceiver is a very good kind of word for it. It's often described as a reducing valve. This is something that's more broadly known as filter theory. It's not a new concept. It came along actually in the late 1800s. I mean, William James, who was the head of psychology at Harvard, was a very big proponent of filter theory. F.C.S. Schiller around the same time. Aldous Huxley in the U.S., who wrote the book Doors of Perception. That was about his mescaline experiences, but very heavily focused on the brain as a filter that allowed this more primordial unified consciousness to filter down into our individual consciousness as a little eddy current. And, when we're living these lives in these bodies, it seems that consciousness is ours and ours alone. And yet there's plenty of evidence that telepathy, for example, identical twins, about 35% of them will have such powerful telepathic experiences that one of them can touch a hot stove and the other twin 1,000 miles away might feel pain and develop a blister. That kind of work, for example, if you look at Guillaume Playfair's book on twin telepathy, you'll find a tremendous amount of information on that topic. Another version of that is Dr. Larry Dossey. He's a good friend of mine, a colleague. He's written extensively on consciousness, and he, in many ways, came up with this notion of the one mind. Now, many people say that our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is an excellent resource on the one mind hypothesis, but I would credit Larry Dossey with coming up with that first. And he wrote a book called One Mind. I think it came out around 2011 or so, 2012, but it's an incredibly good book. And the thing is, he was an identical twin, and he and his twin married identical twins. So they had a lot of twin stuff going on, and that includes a lot of kind of telepathic experiences. And that's one of the reasons that Larry was attracted to this notion of the one mind that we're sharing. And I think his book is an extraordinary kind of introduction to that concept. In fact, in this discussion, I would steer many people who want scientific proof for the reality of an afterlife, go to bigelowinstitute.org. You'll find 29 essays that were written 4 years ago from many different directions, all from scientists who had at least 5 years experience studying the afterlife question. And at bigelowinstitute.org, you'll find all the evidence you've ever needed for the scientific reality of the afterlife and even of reincarnation. But I mention that because the second place winner, Dr. Pim van Lommel, who wrote an excellent essay, Jeffrey Mishlove wrote an excellent first place essay, but in that second place essay by Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist who had studied NDEs for the better part of half a century, he concludes his essay by talking about the one mind hypothesis. And that's where he points out Larry Dossey's book. He points out our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. He also points out the book Spiritual Science by Steve Taylor, and finally a paper by Bernardo Kastrup in the Journal of Consciousness Studies from 2018. That paper is entitled The Universe in Consciousness. And those four resources, according to Pim van Lommel, are some of the very best go-to scientific resources to prove the one mind hypothesis, that our brain is a reducing valve or filter, allowing this primordial unified consciousness to come into our awareness. And it's a complete flip from the old materialist position where each one of us is a separate being with a separate brain. And this is much more kind of harmonious and closer to truth example of reality in promoting idealism, that is the primacy of mind over matter, or even panentheism, that mind is so unified that we can look at it as the God mind and that all the universe is distributed within that God mind.
Now, where's the scientific consensus today versus when you started on just concepts of consciousness and materialism? Have we moved that far yet?
We've had tremendous progress in the last 10 to 15 years about this. I know that Karen's my wife. She's also the co-author of Living in a Mindful Universe, and she's the co-founder of the company sacredacoustics.com, which produces binaural beat brainwave entrainment. I use binaural beats daily for meditation, been doing that for more than 11 years. But the truth of the matter is this kind of meditation can be very important at getting to these kind of deep truths. And I'm sorry, your question again was specifically on
where the scientific consensus is right now on consciousness. Yes. Are we still kind of mired in the past?
Karen and I were at a meeting in 2018 in Belgium where one of the neuroscientists got up and showed a slide. And basically, they showed a fourfold increase in the annual number of scientific papers devoted to the topic of near-death experiences that started in 2013. And they attributed that to the publication of the book Proof of Heaven, that in many ways that seemed to be the key that opened the door for many scientists on this topic, was my report of my NDE. Now, I don't know if that's true or if I was just very fortunate in timing, but there is no question that the number of scientific papers on NDEs quadrupled in 2013 compared to the 32-year average before that time. And that effect has continued. Now, I can also tell you that from my viewpoint, for example, one of the best go-to scientific resources on all this, beyond that bigelowinstitute.org website that has 29 scientific essays on it, is the work out of University of Virginia. And that is especially headed up by Ed Kelly. Ed Kelly's the head of their kind of parapsychological arm. He had spent time at Duke, at the Rhine Center. He spent time in electrical engineering at UNC Chapel Hill, and then been here at UVA for a long time. And as I mentioned earlier, that division of perceptual studies is something that for 60 years or so has been studying past life memories in children, near-death experiences, reports of telepathy, remote viewing, etc., psychokinesis, manipulation of matter at a distance. All these things have been studied at UVA. And Ed Kelly has actually edited 3 books that for the rigorous scientists out there who really want the most rigorous scientific information, and these are deep books indeed, and also very thick books. There are demands on your attention. First was Irreducible Mind, edited by Ed Kelly in 2008, I believe it was, or 2007. And the next came in 2015, Beyond Physicalism, again by Ed Kelly. And then finally, in March of 2021, out came Consciousness Unbound, again, edited by Ed Kelly. These are extremely capable scientists, very rigorous, with the deepest demands for getting towards truth. And the conclusion is quite clear that, you can just see it from the titles of those books, Irreducible Mind, Beyond Physicalism, Consciousness Unbound, that we are leaving materialism behind as a hopelessly inadequate scientific model or worldview. And I think it's especially important to point out that in the year 2022, the Nobel Prize in Physics was given out for entanglement. Now, you'll find plenty of quantum physicists out there who will say, well, entanglement doesn't have anything to do with consciousness, but they don't realize what's going on with consciousness, and scientists who study consciousness. And it turns out that entanglement field fills the bill perfectly for what we would expect as a field of consciousness that allows connection across space and time. And I think it's kind of a no-brainer. It should be quite obvious to people who reflect largely on all these topics that field of entanglement absolutely links in beautifully with our notions of the mental kind of phase of the universe, the mental layer. And you can start that argument just by going back to 2005 to the scientific journal Nature, very esteemed scientific journal, where Richard Kahn Henry, who was the head of astrophysics at Johns Hopkins University, wrote a beautiful one-page essay entitled The Mental Universe. And he makes it very clear in that paper that according to the most recent kind of interpretations and open-minded acceptance of the findings of quantum physics, you realize that mind is primary and that the universe is fundamentally mental and spiritual. Enjoy. Those are actually the last words of his essay, because physicalism itself had been disproven. And he knew sooner or later that Nobel Prize would be given for entanglement. And just as the founding fathers of quantum physics, like Werner Heisenberg, Max Planck, Erwin Schrödinger, Pascual Jordan, they all made statements about the primacy of consciousness, how it was not simply derivative from the brain, but something much grander in the universe. And that's exactly what experiments proving the reality of entanglement have shown us over the last 4 or 5 decades. So that award by the Nobel Prize Committee was a gigantic statement that the ages of worshiping four-dimensional space-time as the ultimate theater of operations of our universe were gone. And we were now into a whole new level where we recognize that time flow in the earthly realm is not some master clock of the universe, but that there are actually relationships that go much deeper that allow us to have these kind of mental experiences like life reviews in an NDE, where 1/3 of people actually say that the life review involves their complete life, every event of their life. And, for those of us sitting here trying to pretend that your life flashing before your eyes is just kind of a dream state or wishful thinking memories, that's wrong. That doesn't cover the big picture of what people are describing of this. And the other most important thing to say about life reviews, for one thing, that about half of people say they're more real than events lived in this physical body. But the most important thing I would say is that in life reviews, about 3/4 of people who have them say that it's from the perspective of everyone involved. So in other words, when you have a life review, it's not just your little vague memories of things that happen. You re-experience the events from the perspective of everyone involved. So if you were busy handing out pain and suffering to others, you feel that during your life review. In fact, I think there's no evidence for any kind of eternal hell, but that hell would come from the life review of someone who has handed out tons of pain and suffering to other people, like Hitler. His life review would not be a fun thing to go through because he has to experience a tremendous amount of what he dished out. And that's true for all of us. So in many ways, it's like the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated, is written into the very fabric of the universe. So to me, this kind of unpacking of the reality of near-death experiences, the power of revelation of these life reviews about kind of a moral and ethical judgment that's carried out by our higher soul. It's not a judgment from any higher being, but in the light and love of that beautiful realm, to witness what you did, if it was selfish and greedy or handing out pain and suffering, feels especially bad. So in many ways, the life review just gently nudges us more towards love, kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance with necessary forgiveness, but to really lead that life that many religions have been trying to teach us to lead all along. But now, with the scientific evidence of near-death experiences and the binding force of love to support it all, we can pay much more attention to these events as instructive about how to live our lives. And this world needs to change and move away from the false sense of separation inherent in materialism, more into where science now says the world is being led by this deeper kind of nature of truth. And that is one of interconnectedness of mind, the binding force of love, all being this together. So if you hurt another, you're hurting yourself. There's some tremendous kind of moral and ethical lessons that come packaged with this deep scientific truth of the primacy of consciousness.
Now, in some of these life reviews that are reported, have there ever been any instances where someone in their life review says, well, what if instead of X, I did Y, and then it lays out how that change in action would have unfolded?
Well, I think it's more of a recognition of your responsibility for how you're treating others. And so you come to see in a life review that it's not just your actions, but even your thoughts that can have such an influence. And I think what people find is that the more that in the life review, if they start to appreciate how kinder, gentler, more harmonizing thoughts would have changed the situation, that becomes the life lesson they learn. There are some of the accounts I've heard that do as you suggest. They allow for an actual changing of the events of the past. I don't know how far I would want to push that because it's kind of difficult to prove if you actually get kind of a quantum level change in the memory of those events or not. Although I would say there are other developments in quantum physics that show very clearly that our general notions of causality, and what is called
retrocausality. Yeah,
retrocausality is what I'm getting at. And that is, I think it's Daniel Sheehan, I think his last name Sheehan, not certain of the first name, physicist out in San Diego, has actually had 3 conferences on retrocausality in quantum physics. And those 3 conference proceedings are actually available on my website, ebenalexander.com. There's a recommended reading list where I have a lot of important papers and books that are related to these topics. They're all categorized. And Sheehan's 3 conferences, you might have actually had another one by now. They were going on about every 6 years or so. And some incredibly fascinating work. But it suggests that our notion of time flow in the earthly realm is nowhere near a complete version of the kind of causal efforts that occur in our universe and link causes with effects across space and time. But that's one of the important lessons of this entanglement anyway, is to show us that there's a whole much deeper kind of interconnectedness of events across space and time than we would like to think. In many ways, that by giving a Nobel Prize for entanglement, what they were saying is that the old concepts that Einstein hewed so closely to, local realism, that there's some part of local realism that cannot possibly be true for entanglement to be real. And local, in the phrase local realism, the local means that all physics involves particles touching each other, that there aren't other kind of modulating influences that do not involve particles touching. But an assumption in physics is that it's all local. And that was the thing that Einstein assumed. But with entanglement, you can no longer say that. And the realism part of local realism is that there's an objective physical universe that exists out there prior to measurement. And what quantum physics has been screaming at us for the better part of a century, as Pascal Jordan says, we not only observe this universe, we actually create it through the act of observation. So there's a very deep relationship of choices of the mind of the investigator, of the observer, and how they influence the emergent behavior that is observed. We cannot separate ourselves from the events that we're assessing in experiments in quantum physics. And that's very important because, once again, it is simply stressing to us the primacy of mind itself. And in many ways, giving us some power of mind over matter. Because one of the strong statements that comes out of that materialist science that I used to worship for my coma is that consciousness is an illusion. And that, in fact, everything is predetermined. And they say that because the notion is that all of this is happening because the substance, the atoms and molecules and physical particles in my brain are following the laws of physics, chemistry, biology. And where would you inject free will into that system? It turns out that what they're missing is the only thing we're experiencing is the inside of our own consciousness. And that consciousness is the primordial thing that exists in this universe. And that all of us are sharing this one mind in this form of consciousness. It's an evolution of consciousness and an understanding of itself. And this is where, to me, this whole notion of idealism or panentheism really kind of jumps ahead as the most viable way to assess our reality. But the good news about all that is it brings free will right back to the forefront of the picture. If mind, if idealism and panentheism are the true working models showing the primacy of consciousness and the importance of our choices and free will, then you start realizing that our general sense that we do have free will and that we're agents that basically affect our emerging reality because of our free will. And that seems to be true. We seem to be in that world. And this emerging worldview model in the scientific community fully supports that notion of free will. That is, by moving beyond materialism, physicalism, into a realm of idealism and panentheism.
Now, in terms of what this all implies about the nature of reality, you mentioned since your near-death experience, you started talking about binaural beats, using that for meditation. How have you evolved since then in terms of meditation and other things? I think in your book you mentioned Robert Monroe, OBEs, things like that.
Right. Well, for one thing, when I first came back, because of that amnesia, when my doctors told me you can forget about it, your brain was soaking in pus. In fact, we have no idea how you're coming back to us. I believed everything they told me. We believe our doctors, and my neuroscience knowledge, my cosmology and physics knowledge, that was still 2 months away from returning. And so, okay, it was all of, and as I told my son, my older son, Eben IV, he was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time. And he drove home 2 days after I got out of the hospital. He gave me a big hug. He told me later it was like there was a light shining within me. I was far more present than I'd ever been before. But I remember telling him it was way too real to be real. That's kind of the assumption I took away from that conversation with my doctors. They had told me it couldn't be real. To me, it seemed way too real to be real. And what I was just beginning to realize is it seemed that way because it really happened. But it didn't happen in this physical universe. It happened in a much more primary kind of ideal world of our conscious awareness. And that's why the message was so pure. It had to do, with this part of my adoption history that I wasn't aware of yet, that I was only beginning to discover. And that was an extraordinary experience, was going through that unfolding over a few months of having all my memories return, realizing, and then I started diving into the NDE literature, read hundreds of cases, and realized that spiritual guide was always somebody very important to you in life. I knew her so well because of our mind meld during the experience. And yet, when I came back to this world, I knew I'd never met her in my life. That part was shocking. It was almost a deal breaker because I also was thinking, well, that was supposed to be my adoptive father. He was the one closest to me who had passed over 4 years earlier. How come that didn't happen? So for me, all of this, there was incredible tension in my kind of interpretation of it. And that all came to a beautiful, powerful resolution about 4 months after my coma, when I received a picture in the mail. Now, that whole story is told at the end of Proof of Heaven. I don't want to ruin that for people, but the bottom line is it's a very important step. I think that is why so many people found the book to be so powerful. And I know that there were thousands of people who actually wrote me based on both the talks I started giving 2 years before Proof of Heaven came out, but also based on that book, where they said that something about my words reminded them of something that in many ways they think they had forgotten. It was a subconscious memory of their own soul journey. And literally thousands of people were excited by that aspect of reading the book Proof of Heaven. And I think that's very important, that it reminded so many people of something so deep. And of course, to me as a scientist, I've been working for 16 years since all this happened with other scientists around the world. I know it was about 2 years after my coma, literally to the hour after awakening from coma, that I found myself driving up the highway from where I lived and where all this had happened in Lynchburg, Virginia, up to Charlottesville, Virginia, to give a talk to the Division of Perceptual Studies, to that group I've mentioned before. And I didn't know the group at the time. I knew they were interested in NDEs and past life memories in children and parapsychological phenomena, but I didn't know how they would take my story. I mean, would they consider it a real contribution or just kind of an anomaly or something that you could dismiss or what? I had no idea. But they were totally into it. And we had a very extended discussion, including lunch that spilled out onto the mall near where they are in Charlottesville, Virginia. And then at the end of my time there, many hours spent with them, feeling a real camaraderie with this group of scientists, Ed Kelly gave me a copy of his book, Irreducible Mind. I'd never seen that book before. It had only been published back in, I think, 2007 or 8. And it's 800 pages. It's a dense scientific tome on the reality of phenomena of mind that are not simply attributable to the workings of the brain. It's an incredibly good book. And then, of course, his sequels to that in the trilogy, Beyond Physicalism, A Consciousness Unbound, are incredibly important scientific works. Now, our book, Living in Mindful Universe, has a lot of science in it, science and spirituality, and shows how they're coming together, just as Pim Van Lommel in his essay recommended our book as a beautiful source of one mind kind of cosmology. But I think Ed Kelly's works, from my perspective, are the premier kind of scientific demonstrations of the reality of this primacy of mind and this kind of advance of spirituality. And as we point out in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, spirituality and science move forward hand in hand. They strengthen each other tremendously. And that's why I think this modern scientific discussion is so important, because it's leading us towards this acknowledgement from a scientific perspective. And science is important because it allows mutual kind of objective knowledge sharing. And that's exactly what's happening in these books and in Living in a Mindful Universe and at that BigelowInstitute.org website with the 29 essays all proving reality of the afterlife. We've moved beyond a point where it's a debate between science and spiritual people as to whether or not this is real. It's determined by BigelowInstitute.org and by Ed Kelly's books that the spiritual realm is absolutely real. We just need to learn much more about how it all works. The good news is, as an individual, all of your viewers don't have to wait for some of those slower kind of materialist scientists to catch up. You can jump on board with where all this is going now. And in fact, Living in a Mindful Universe I've talked about, but there's also a free companion workbook online that goes with that book. And any of your listeners can jump on board with that free program right now. It's called Your 33-Day Journey into the Heart of Consciousness. If you go to EbenAlexander.com, that banner wiggles in your face right on the entry page, the landing page, and you can leave your first name and an email address, and you're off and running to a 33-day email drip campaign where each day you'll receive an email with a major thought concept from the book Living in a Mindful Universe, There are actually 4 sacred acoustics exercises bundled for free in that package of the 33-day journey. So it's a good way to get into meditation and learn how meditation can contribute to your individual journeying and understanding of all of these kind of topics and potential experiences. So sacredacoustics.com is a good resource, but here at 33-day journey at ebenalexander.com, people can get on board. More than 12,000 people have already taken that course. They leave comments and help each other. So there's a big community growing up at 33-day journey. And it's just a great way to get into it. You don't have to spend a penny on it. You can just get going. And believe me, the sky's not even the limit beyond that point.
And I'll put those links below so that people can easily access that.
Good.
So one question I definitely had, and this is your first book, but wasn't the main point of the first book. It was at the very beginning. You had an experience that was similar to an experience I had. I always chalk the experience up to, there's some matter in the brain that allows you to function this way. And I'll just very quickly, when I was in the military, I was in training, I was in my Humvee, I was standing outside the hatch with my 50 caliber machine gun, and we were driving fast through the desert. I told my driver to turn right. And in that moment, I could feel that the Humvee was about to pancake, right? Where it just rolled over flat, crushed me. But while it was happening, I felt like I had all the time in the world. It just kind of time just slowed. This is and I think you know the event I'm referring to, when you were jumping out of an airplane. There was, someone was in front of you and you had to make a quicker decision than your brain would have allowed you to make. So when that happened to me, I thought maybe there's just a mechanism in the brain that kind of focuses all your energy so that time seems to slow. But like Dr. Alexander, I feel like I could have taken the calculus test during the period. Like it slowed so much that there was no panic. I had all the time in the world to just duck down into the Humvee, grab onto something, and I walked out of that. Nobody was harmed. I was completely untouched. So what is the mechanism by which that works? Is there a mechanism in the brain that does that? I mean, I think in your book you answer the question, but yeah.
Well, what I would say is that we have to leave behind the notion that this is due to things occurring in the brain. And I mean, there's plenty of evidence the brain is not the ultimate producer of consciousness. Some of the best evidence actually comes from modern studies of fMRI, magnetoencephalography, which are great ways of looking at every neuron in the brain and checking out their activity and how it relates to others in these big neuronal networks. And for example, under the influence of psilocybin, LSD, DMT, these serotonin 2A type psychedelic substances, what you find is no part of the brain increases activity, it all diminishes. So as a neuroscientist, if you're using these tools trying to track down why do people on these substances have such phenomenal experiences, you have to let go of the notion that it's due to increased neuronal activity anywhere in the brain, because it's not. The brain is getting out of the way, which means we need a much bigger theater of operations to try and explain all this. Now, the other thing to point out is that our notions of time in many ways are deeply linked to our understanding of consciousness. We kind of think that time marches along independent of what we may think about it, and that time is universal. Well, quantum physics and relativity has shown us very clearly that time is not universal, that you have to kind of dissect it out much more to even understand how it works at all. And I would say right now, physics has just about zero idea what's actually going on with time. But we do know that time varies a lot. That's very clear from relativity, where it's shown that the faster something goes, the slower its time progresses until it hits the speed of light, at which there is no progression in time. So for a photon traveling through space, a light particle, it doesn't actually experience a progression of time. And it gets much more complex than that. We were talking earlier about retrocausality in quantum physics. So these are all reflections that our notions of time are not so universal, and that there's much more that we need to understand about it all. And that these events that you're referring to, like in my case, it involved a parachuting incident. So I was on the parachute team, UNC Chapel Hill, made 365 jumps or so during college. And I describe one of those jumps that almost became a midair collision with another jumper in the opening to the book Proof of Heaven. And what you're referring to there is my sense that my mind, my mental capacities could go far faster than anything my brain was capable of doing. And I still think that's a huge part of the lesson there. I know in my research in the 16 years since, in looking at all these different phenomena of consciousness, there's certainly something that's been very well demonstrated called precognition. That is, that people can know the future a few seconds in advance. And that information we discuss in detail in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, the work of Daryl Bem, who is a psychologist at Cornell in New York. And he did some extraordinary experiences showing that in a simple computer model where you had three kinds of images that might show up, either very kind of disturbing and disgruntling messages, very neutral messages, or very benign and pleasing messages. And that he could show statistically that somehow the viewing subject knew what was going to come up next, even before the computer made the random selection. That's a very important point, because what we're really discussing here is, did that subject, were they able to read the future to somehow know what that kind of predetermined image was going to be, or did they actually cause it themselves? And I would think the latter is actually a more likely response. And it's not a kind of the ego level of your mind, but that higher soul level of the mind that's actually selecting the picture that the computer's going to show. Again, it just shows you that very broad concept that comes out of quantum physics, that not only do we observe a future, but we actually end up creating the future by some of the choices we make. It's something that John Archibald Wheeler, who was in the Manhattan Project and was head of physics at Princeton for a while, he called the participatory anthropic principle. And he came up with that term. And anthropic is kind of human. You know, the anthropic means that human mind and human existence plays a deep role in these things that happen. And Wheeler recognized that. And in that discussion, he was actually applying it to a model of his called the delayed choice quantum eraser, where he was trying a very advanced electronic switching analysis of photons going through, a beam splitter and double slit kind of experiments in such a way that they could be observed to either show particle or wave characteristics. And what he was saying is that, in effect, the choices made by the observing scientist dictate all the way back to the origin of that photon billions of years ago from a distant galaxy as to whether or not it would demonstrate primarily wave or particle behavior. And so just astonishing stuff to come out of quantum physics. But I think it's very clear that the primacy of mind is right there at the core. And that when you acknowledge things like Daryl Bem's work, which has been corroborated in a multi-center meta-analysis of precognition studies, it's beyond any reasonable doubt that this is a real effect, that people can kind of know the future. And I think in many ways, their higher soul is kind of creating that future, and that's what they're aware of. But I wouldn't say it's predetermined. That's very important. And so Wheeler, when he makes this point about these observations, he puts himself in the category of an idealist. He says he's similar to George Berkeley, who was an Irish theologian who had lived 200 years earlier. Now, Berkeley's notion of idealism was really one of more of solipsism. The thing, I know I have a mind, but how do I know that other minds exist in the universe? Because all I have are perceptions, but they don't tell me with absolute certainty that the other minds truly exist. And I would say that this modern version of idealism, the one that I would say is so aligned with Wheeler and his observations, is really one that acknowledges that we all have minds that are simply eddy currents of the one primordial mind, and that we're sharing in this kind of evolution of consciousness itself. And if anybody asks, what's the reason for all of this? I would say it is for consciousness to evolve. Just as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, in his book, The Mid-20th Century, The Phenomenon of Man, he acknowledged that there was evolution going on in the universe, but he knew it was much more than just Darwinian evolution on Earth of biological systems. But as a French Jesuit priest, he had a spiritual history, but as a paleontologist, he was a scientist working on billion-year timescales. So he was a perfect person to kind of put all the pieces together and realize that evolution is occurring in the form of consciousness evolving to a higher form. It's coming to understand itself. And just like that old saying, all politics is local, I would say all cosmic consciousness and evolution thereof is nothing more than individual sentient beings coming to a deeper understanding of their own kind of reasons for existence and connection with the universe at large. And so all of us as sentient beings are contributing to this unfolding knowledge of the one mind itself and a deeper understanding of the way things work. And in many ways, I would say this is a resolution to conflicts and challenges that have existed for human beings for more than 5,000 years. And we're slowly bringing all that kind of knowledge and understanding together in a way that makes sense to the individual, to our culture at large, to the scientific community, the philosophical community, sooner or later the theological community. But we'll all start to realize that these deep lessons are there to help us understand why we're here in the first place.
Why now? Why do you think this is, or at least it feels like there's a kind of a quickening in terms of this knowledge and this change in perception of consciousness at this particular point in history? I would just say that
we're approaching the right time. I mean, there's a quote that I love from Nikola Tesla. You know, he's the man who's responsible for our modern electrified world, came up with alternating currents as the main way to do power distribution. But he died in poverty in the 1940s because he was kind of outmaneuvered politically by Thomas Edison and Westinghouse and others. But the reality is that Nikola Tesla was a brilliant scientist, and he had his own spiritual experience when his own mother passed in New York City. He had a profound shared death experience with her that in many ways changed his viewpoint of the spiritual. But he also said, famously, this is from Nikola Tesla, he said that when science begins to investigate non-physical phenomena, they will discover more in the first decade than in all their previous centuries of existence. And I think we're getting very close to entering that decade where science starts to rigorously investigate non-physical phenomena. That's something that the group at Division of Perceptual Studies has been doing for decades, something that the Institute of Noetic Sciences has been doing for decades. But the scientific community at large has yet to make this major shift to investigating non-physical phenomena. And I think we're very close to that point because the evidence is so overwhelming. The BigelowInstitute.org essays are really stellar, and they point out in many different directions how a deeper understanding of the primacy of mind is key to our understanding of all the events going on in our universe, all the physical events, everything that we associate with space, time, mass, energy, every bit of it will become much clearer as we refine this notion of consciousness and its role in the unfolding universe.
Any final words for the audience, Dr. Alexander?
I'd say the best news is no soul left behind. You were asking earlier, why now? Well, I'm not sure why now, but what I can tell you is I think from the grand perspective of those who investigate consciousness and these kind of phenomena about the nature of reality, we've come to realize that we've spent thousands of years kind of getting to this point. And this is an absolutely crucial inflection point about where the world is headed. I mean, for one thing, we've put our world into great danger with our addiction to fossil fuels, global warming. It's all very real. It's not a made-up hoax at all. And unfortunately, our children and grandchildren are going to pay a much worse price than they might have to because of our ignorance and our irresponsibility as stewards of this planet. It's high time we woke up and took a much richer responsibility for who we are and where this planet is headed, and certainly taken responsibility as a scientific kind of society and culture that our scientific abilities like transportation and burning of carbon-based fuels doesn't end up killing many species on this planet. I mean, there are literally thousands of species that are now headed for extinction if we don't change our ways. So it's high time that we grew up and matured as a species to a much wiser level, paid attention to the deep truths that we're observing through scientific investigation, and take charge of the challenges to our planet that have been introduced. This also includes nuclear weapons, modern warfare. Every bit of that needs to go the way of the dodo, go extinct, because of this modern unfolding of worldviews of the primacy of consciousness and that we're all in this together teaches us to show kindness, mercy, compassion, acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness. And this involves taking care not only of our fellow human beings, but taking care of all the other plant and animal life with which we share this beautiful planet. But we're the species who are doing all the damage and who are threatening others with extinction. So I'm simply saying that this awakening that we're talking about now must inherently involve a deeper sense of responsibility for the planet at large. So any and all of us can participate in this revolution, not only through meditation, of course. Meditation is what gives us a respite from the demands of the little ego mind. That little voice in your head is not your consciousness. Your awareness of that voice is what's important to stress and emphasize. And that's what can be greatly exacerbated through the use of something like sacredacoustics.com binaural beat brainwave entrainment that allows us to put that ego voice into timeout and to come into touch with a much richer and broader aspect of kind of our unified, grander consciousness, our higher soul. And that's where we can certainly gain insight, because the universe can give us tremendous clues in deep meditation, especially when we've set our ego voice aside. But it's really how we live these lives, what we do, the choices we make, how we view ourselves and others. That's what will really change the world for the better. And that's where I would encourage all of your listeners to get on board with this extraordinary kind of expansion of human knowledge and human ability. Get into meditation, but also get into changing this world through the actions you take day to day and week to week. And that is taking care of other people, random acts of kindness, and certainly standing up to the kind of bullyism and narcissism and authoritarianism that has a way of rising up in our modern world. But it's time for the people to take this world back. And this is people who are awakened, who recognize that we're all in this together. We're here to care for each other. And that's where the world, as I see it, will move in the best positive direction.
Well, thank you, Dr. Alexander. It was an absolute pleasure. And good luck on all the future endeavors and kind of convincing the world that we live in a universe that is far broader and loving than it may appear to us on kind of the outward basis. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for doing what you do, Sean, to get this out there. I appreciate your having me on today, and maybe we'll talk again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. You take care. Thanks.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and you can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.